Hey, what's going on? This is Joshua. I'm here with Owen, and today we're talking about the state of emergency, which is the final chapter to Paul Virilio's 1977 text, Speed and Politics, which was then released in English in 2006 by Semiotext. So we're going to give an overview of basically the content of that chapter and how we think that it demonstrates the relevance and vitality of Virilio's thought today. And obviously, of course, that's in conjunction with our course on Paul Virilio, which we are launching November 4th. So Virilio starts off this chapter by invoking Sun Tzu, who states that speed is the essence of war. This then unfolds because one of Virilio's main themes is the acceleration of reality. So we might say in that context that we're seeing an acceleration of warfare at an unprecedented scale. Furthermore, there is a sort of there's a transformation between spatial conflict to what he refers to as the war of time. And this is something connected with vehicular performance in particular that we see, let's say, in and around the World War I, World War II epoch, which then bring in the idea of total war mobilization, which then obviously in the Cold War move into an era of what he calls pure war. And then finally, the contemporary scene, which he views as being characterized by impure war, which is, this is where we go beyond even just like war by proxy and so on and so forth into an era of basically asymmetrical and in many cases cyber war and so forth. And one sort of very interesting parallel here would be the idea that as we move from the state of siege to what he calls the state of emergency, what we have here is there's a parallel that you might draw with Giorgio Agamben, where Agamben talks about the state of exception. And he, of course, is invoking Carl Schmitt, who is saying that the person who is sovereign is the one who creates or makes the exception. And so we saw states of exception created with, for instance, let's say in the post 9/11 period, where you have basically the Patriot Act and sort of unprecedented state surveillance and sort of the whole like Guantanamo Bay, all of these sorts of things. And then so the claim here, the connection would be the idea that with the acceleration of reality, you actually have the creation of a state of emergency and the acceleration of states of exception. And what I mean by this would be that you go from post 9/11 period, the so-called war on terror is something that lasted, I don't know, a good 20 something years, but really like 5. And then we move into, let's say, like the financial crisis is the new state of exception. And then after that, we get a multiplicity in rapid succession. And this is what is called on the internet, arguably, the so-called current thing, which would be COVID, vaccination, Ukraine, and so on and so forth, just basically a rapid fire procession of states of exception. And I'll give Owen a chance to comment on, any or all of the above.
Yeah, that was a good introductory summary. I think one thing that was coming to mind there when we were referring Virilio to Agamben is, I think at least Agamben's book, State of Exception, I think he's a bit more interested in the legal framework of the state of exception. Whereas for Virilio, it's very much a kind of technological issue to do with information technology and what he calls the synchronization of emotions, particularly fear. We're kind of synchronized into states of perpetual panic and fear. It's somewhat an ontological problem. I think I brought this up in the last conversation, where things which are threats are no longer dealt with as particular events or objects. They get displaced into environments and so forth. So that's, it's this kind of ontological problem there. And also psychopolitical, because it seems today we're governed and led by fear. Like there's no way it's almost like there's a complete abandonment of reasoning with people, of inspiring people, of even the kind of old capitalistic, advertising and marketing, give them something that they want to kind of appeal to this kind of rational consumer mindset. It's largely been displaced nowadays by a sort of marketing campaign of constant crisis and fear. I feel like all the big corporations are constantly talking about things which involve some sort of crisis, like climate change or something like this, right? So, I definitely think Virilio has a lot to offer in the analysis of the state of exception or the state of emergency. Those are just some introductory thoughts. There's a lot more to get into, but I'll hand it back over to you first.
Absolutely. And so now one very fascinating thing here that I think that we could draw a parallel would be like, okay, so you have Agamben, the state of exception, and probably the most sort of pertinent application of that prior to COVID, let's say, would have been 9/11, because it really brought together all of the themes that he had been working on in his career up until then. Obviously, a very touchy subject, but the argument would be something along the lines that right off the bat, 9/11 is a technical progress accident, not as it relates to the intent of the actual terrorists, but just in the sense that, creation of the airliner is something that facilitated this sort of modality. Obviously, we'd seen attacks, or we had seen implementation of this sort of method before, let's say, starting with the kamikaze pilots of World War II. But here you have skyscrapers, and Virilio is an architect. He has made the point, he wrote a text on this that's called Ground Zero, and he's really talking about techno-scientific consciousness, progress, and this sort of rationality and so forth. He looks at the casualty numbers of an event such as Pearl Harbor, where you have ships, planes, a fully developed military apparatus, in attack mode, versus 9/11, where you basically have 12 individuals with box cutters, in essence, are able to effectuate this sort of a very similar casualty count, in or around 3,000, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's one element. He also points to the idea, this is just sort of a sideline, but that one of these actual terrorists had apparently done like a master's thesis on in the realm of architecture, and actually referenced the Twin Towers in that context. So it's hard to say that, there wasn't a certain level of sophistication there. But ultimately, and similar to Baudrillard, what he's pointing to is really the idea of how 9/11 is something that really stupefied the techno-scientific consciousness of people in the US in particular, but in the West more generally. In fact, it's a semiotic event where you have these towers, the World Trade Center, which are representative of, basically a center of global techno-capitalism, basically being taken down by some of our most sophisticated technologies, in this case, these airplanes, and that now our entire sort of Western media apparatus that had been advanced since the Gulf War, CNN 24 hours a day sort of news and so on and so forth, are now taking the video and the images of this attack on these symbols of global techno capital and basically playing them on like nonstop repeat forever, so that it's been replicated, probably billions of times, if not more, by this moment. Therefore, it's really a sort of, there's an aesthetic and semiotic sort of meaning to this whole thing that is unprecedented in the history of, let's say, warfare, media, and so on and so forth. And, that's something Baudrillard also talks about. Obviously, you have the creation of a state of exception here, also lending itself, all of the above, as he says, to a politics of the very worst. But another sort of unique kind of connection that could be made is arguments pertaining to then the U.S. invasion of Iraq not just, I think the most quotidian sort of argument there is just to say it was a war based on oil. There could be some truth to that, but kind of the argument's got to be laid out for what that is, where really it has to do with enforcing harder doctrine, having to do with using military force to stabilize the region, to secure the flow of oil. So, and that's one of the main strategic imperatives related to that, in spite of what was communicated to the general public. And so basically, really what you have here is a state of exception that has to do with US based oil dependency in some sense. And then at the same time, now in that region, this is another theme that Virilio talks about fairly extensively in what is it? He has I believe it was a museum exhibition called Native Land, and it's talking about mass migration. And so there are some interesting paradoxes here in the sense that, so we invade Iraq, not necessarily because of its contact points with 9/11, but because of this sort of ulterior strategic imperative to secure, basically the flow of this resource from, the region. And in the meantime, this then lends itself to more instability and then further mass migration at that point. And some of the people who, let's say, they supported the war in Iraq on the basis of some sort of security set of arguments pertaining to security and so forth, then at the same time may have been opposed to the idea of mass migration in some sense, although these are both very much connected, and then they're connected to fossil fuel dependency. You have all of that, and that's how it relates to 9/11. If you want to respond to some of those points, we could then keep jumping through the numerous states of exception that have been created in the past, 2 decades.
No, I think it's good to go back to 9/11 because I think this was probably the beginning of this state of emergency era. As far as I can tell anyway. And I think this kind of what you were pointing to there, I think you mentioned earlier the state of siege is being replaced by the state of emergency. And I think within that same paragraph, Virilio says the statesman, the kind of political leader, is being replaced by the state apparatus. So you have systems of interconnectivity, which are largely replacing human decision making. Although I would argue that they're not completely replacing human decision making. It's just that they make bad human decision making much worse because, as you were kind of pointing to, there's a domino effect. So one crisis leads to another crisis, which leads to another crisis. In this case, 9/11 leads to this retaliation, which leads to a kind of destruction of that region, which leads to an immigration crisis into Europe, which leads to a political crisis in Europe, and so forth. So you have like a response to a threat or a problem ending up in like 5 more problems. This is interconnectivity of problems. And I think Virilio is he's a good analyst of that interconnectivity. One of the things he's very interested in, he brings up in the information bomb. The information bomb will also spread the kind of phenomenology of crisis. So we have the more concrete systems of crisis. For example, the Ukraine war led to the energy crisis in Europe and so forth. We have more concrete interconnectivities because of global capitalism. But we also have just the kind of phenomenological interconnectivity, which creates a kind of psychological and a phenomenological sense of crisis, even in regions where there is no crisis. There is no like immediate material crisis. 9/11 was a good example because even in Europe, I mean, I remember that very clearly as being a kid. Probably the first thing I remember seeing on the news is probably 9/11, at least a memorable event. And because we can see these events happening in real time, it draws us into that world. We were all in New York that day, even if you were in Denmark or Sweden or Ireland or whatever. And then through that kind of shared phenomenology, we're also drawn into the same emotional state as that region. So the fear that is related to that particular event or that particular threat gets displaced into anywhere which is consuming and viewing these these systems of information and so forth. So I would definitely say that Virilio is a very good analyst of crisis within the modern world, but also the lack of any kind of adequate response to crisis in which can actually deal with it. We tend to respond to it in a way which perpetuates it, displaces it, creates a new crisis, has a domino effect in that sense. We're not really able to deal with it, and I think that's the key insight, I would say, of Virilio, as an analyst and as a critique of the state of emergency. He's not saying, this kind of maybe a bit more classical liberal response, which would be, like we have to insist on particular human rights, legal rights in any situation dogmatically, regardless of the situation. Like he isn't attacking the state of emergency from that kind of a kind of more legalistic dogma, and so forth. He's attacking it from the sense that it's a sort of self-perpetuating problem.
That's all very good. And, basically, as far as interconnectivity, that lends itself right into the financial crisis of 2008, which he has written about and characterizes that as basically it is a technical progress accident of sort of light speed techno-economic interconnectivity that creates sort of an imposture of immediacy, as he puts it, and then creates these various issues of scale, one of which, this is just an example off the top of my head, but would be the idea that, unlike, let's say, gold-backed currency of some sort, it's now possible for people to achieve levels of wealth where they couldn't even count all of it in their entire lifespan if they even wanted to. And so kind of how the proportions of this, are relatively unprecedented. So you have the creation of all these various financial instruments and so on and so forth. This would be connected with the idea of, let's say, technology being an intensification of human nature, both for the good and for the bad. Here, I think it's quite clear that this was for the bad. And then ultimately, the creation of a state of exception, particularly pertaining to, let's say, the bailouts and so on and so forth. Of course, in a context where you have the devastation of some of these pension funds, and you have, like, I don't know, I guess reports of elderly pensioners basically reduced to like eating dog food.
Something that I was thinking about was the theme of the normalization of crisis, kind of perpetual crisis. Zizek is actually pretty good on this as an analyst. He will often talk about the fact that that we have this sort of perpetual normalization of a crisis, which occurs in this time period. And I do think if you go back to 9/11, and then if you go through 9/11, banking crash, COVID, Ukraine. I saw a meme the other day, and it was like kids that were born in the early 90s, which is me. Your entire adult life is just being crisis. Oh, followed by another crisis. So there's also this issue of the kind of normalization of crisis, which I think is relevant. And that might fit into, I'm not sure what you think about this, but that might fit into the theme of hyperreality.
Yeah, that's perfect. And yeah. I think that's perfect. And like the way I have like COVID, so you have normalization of crisis. Now, all of a sudden, we move into quite unexpected. We move into the era of COVID, which was very much an inciting event in terms of hyperreality in the following sense. Yes. And, I've seen a lot of people have made some really good reflections on this, on Twitter and otherwise. One that definitely comes to mind would be the idea that it's quite unlikely that the economy in the U.S. or, probably almost anywhere else would have been shut down. Like, let's say it was like 1970 under the conditions that we experienced under COVID without actual Zoom. So basically, because of the existence of Zoom, COVID was an inciting incident that basically accelerated the sort of deworlding of all sorts of functional activities into the hypersphere of the internet, as it were. And now, some companies are trying to walk it back to some extent. Like it's unlikely that Zoom would have, accelerated its ubiquity without COVID to some extent, even though obviously, it is a very efficient and effective means of communication that we presently are on. That's one aspect of COVID. COVID obviously falls into the accidentology of Virilio in the sense that it is basically new, sort of just in time logistics that have the implication of being able to not only spread goods and services, but also to spread pathogens of unprecedented rate. That's something that was predicted by Virilio and a few other analysts that are out there. Now you have this sort of deworlding into the hypersphere of the internet, and where people are getting most of their information digitally, lending itself to emotional synchronization, the administration of fear, and so on. Some of the implications of this, one that I thought was the most surprising, is that there was like drone footage, let's say in New York City, of basically mass burials taking place on a place called Hart Island. So we're talking wooden caskets by people in hazmat suits and so on and so forth. Drone footage of this. Then it was reported in the public media. And, even though they did fill in the picture, people were quite shocked by this whole thing. Let's just say on its face, like, the mass burials taking place in this supposedly, extremely sophisticated, technologically advanced, perhaps former economic, financial capital of the world, depending on how you perceive that. But the actual reality of this that is quite fascinating is that they've actually always had mass burials there for the past 100 years or something like this. And it is only under conditions of COVID that this information becomes unconcealed, just because it's consistent with the sort of overall, whatever the ethos was with this whole thing. And or what the overall aesthetics. You have the placement of masks upon various statues of historical sort of significance, these figures. You have a sort of the rise of a techno-scientific irrationalism, where you see various scientific figureheads being depicted, like, for instance, Fauci painted as if he were a, let's say, like Greek Orthodox sort of iconography. Or something along these lines. And also then the treatment, let's say, of, basically, medicine and, the entire medical community as being able to deliver on sort of, elixirs and, things of this nature that actually have a long precedence in the sort of, in the annals of like history, mythology, and so forth. You have the waters of Bimini and, all these other sort of mythological configurations. Furthermore, if you like, it's hard to state with certitude the idea that, this is something that's a product of a lab leak. But if you want to entertain that sort of, that vector, the idea would be that, okay, so you have GOF research, which results in an accident, which then results in basically more techno-scientific acceleration, the acceleration of biotech, mRNA engineering, and so on and so forth, in order to solve that problem. And then obviously, I know you shared it with me that whoever developed the mRNA methodologies is somebody who was then received the Nobel Prize. And this entire direction was analyzed by Virilio in The Information Bomb and elsewhere, where he basically states that, this is setting the stage for basically the next Hiroshima, as it were, the accident of bioengineering.
Yeah, so just to pick up on the theme of hyper reality and the normalization of crisis. I think, as you were saying earlier, like on a kind of technological level, the economy wouldn't have survived if we went into shutdown in 1970s without Zoom. But we could also reverse that and say the virus itself couldn't have been the virus itself without Zoom, because the technology also facilitated us to kind of live in a different reality than the material reality we were used to living in, where we would have actually understood that, okay, this virus is somewhat risky for certain demographics, but for most people, it's relatively mild. And if we were in work with each other, if we were in the pub with each other, if we were in each other, we would have been more able to go, okay, like they're exaggerating this. Come on, I mean, look, like we're here. We we have a phenomenological sense of what reality is. The more we sort of go into this communicative mode of technological mediation of our phenomenological experience in the world, the more it's easier for the experts and the power systems to sort of say, no, but this is going on. This is going on, and like, you know, you better not go outside because you might find out. Whereas if you have to live normal life around people in the real world, like you just know, like you just know the truth from the non-truth. At least you know it more. The more we're sort of pushed into these systems, the more kind of phenomenologically ignorant of the world we become, and the easier it becomes to exaggerate and so on. So there's this sense in which, like, more than just the kind of practical capacity of these technologies, you know, that we can work from home and so forth, I think there's also a kind of conditioning, a kind of techno conditioning into a hyper reality in which we're more and more willing to just kind of accept what we are told, right? No matter how decontextualized it becomes. And you were mentioning the problem with the mass graves in New York, and I remember at the very beginning of COVID, you had this problem of, like, okay, so it started in China, and you had, like, looking back at it now, we can look at the footage from China and go, not only like some of the footage wasn't even from that time. Some of that footage was from like 10 years before, right, or something like that, during some other event. Some of it, looking back at it now, was very clearly fake, actually. Like, it was very clearly the Chinese government having everyone on, you know. And then the next place was Italy. And then we had the same thing, less exaggerated, but more or less the same thing, and it was even scarier because it was in Western Europe. And you had the Italians, and you had all this footage of hospitals being overwhelmed, and this image of destruction and police in the streets, and I don't know, like, this very nitpicked footage was getting released to us. So it was funny. So it was like, as the virus biologically was spreading, the sort of phenomenology of crisis was also spreading, and it wasn't actually spreading in accordance with each other. It wasn't like the images of catastrophe were necessarily proportional to the actual virus. Like, the disproportionality of and state of panic was actually spreading maybe even before or separate to the actual virus, if you get me, you know. And then, of course, it spreads from China to Italy and then to the rest of the world, and then sooner or later we're all just synchronized into this state of panic. But in a way, I was thinking about this, you know, I made a video on my channel recently about panic signaling. If you take a kind of zoological view of it, certain animals will signal, right? So if a herd of wildebeest in the savannah have if one of them sees a hyena or a lion, they will stamp their hooves, or they will twitch their ears, or they will make weird noises, and they will sort of signal to the rest of the group, watch out, there's something there. And I think that when you have a very kind of herdish level of communication, which is very, very responsive to danger, which is always kind of conditioned into danger response, often what happens is we don't really think about the actual object which is threatening itself, the lion or the hyena. What we do is we start thinking about what other people are thinking about. So we start thinking about, okay, well, that person's scared, so something must be real. And it's like, well, where did you get your fear from? Well, I got it from this person. It's like, well, where did he get his fear from? Well, I got it from this person. And you actually realize that there's a kind of self-referential panic which is going on. It's no longer actually addressed to an object. Even if there was an object, there was a threat. It's the actual communication of danger no longer actually attaches itself to an object. It's self-referential. And I think that in that sense, there's a kind of hyper reality going on. This is a bit more of the kind of theoretical and nitty gritty details that we go into in the course. It's worth bringing up here because it sort of shows us how these systems of communication can contain within them a problem in and of themselves. They don't need to be addressing an actual crisis. Like these forms of communication contain within them their own crisis, if that makes sense.
Definitely. As far as phenomenological ignorance is concerned, I think that could transition us right into the derealization of warfare, particularly with respect to Ukraine, which I've seen referenced like on YouTube by some creators as like the first TikTok war, as it were. And basically, over there, I've also seen other commentators, they're drawing the comparison with Baudrillard and sort of his text, the Gulf War didn't take place. And, with that title, what he really meant by that was that the idea for the majority of Americans, not people that actually, were either Iraqis or people that like took up the rifle. Nevertheless, this was very much simulated, as it were. At the same time, Virilio has a critique of Baudrillard where he, instead of simulation, he thinks that there's actually substitution. And he makes that quite clear in a number of places. And basically, with respect to Ukraine, I think that the argument that I've seen people make is the idea that for the majority of people in the U.S., this is not a war in sort of the classical sense, as it were. But the one way that I'd like to really sort of specifically highlight would be we're seeing unprecedented utilization of drone warfare, where basically there's all these quite viral videos on Twitter and so forth of where you have combatants where drones are like literally dropping explosives on top of them. It's just, if you start, let's say, like you could look at sort of the romanticization of like sniping, for instance, where, for a period of time, like you had the one guy, Carlos Hadcock, I think he had 93 confirmed kills during Vietnam. And so there's a romanticization and sort of like an aesthetic sort of build up of the idea of sniping where, basically you're ruthlessly sort of destroying life, as it were. But at the same time, it does incur like, there's a risk. There are like, I think that there's U.S. snipers who are basically ambushed and, their bodies mutilated and so on and so forth. You are actually presenting yourself on the field of battle. And, it entails all these aspects such as performance based, trying to achieve maximal performance at basically sharpshooting, cover and concealment, various methodologies, and so on and so forth. That's why you see, let's say, like all these films like, Sniper with Tom Berenger. Now you move to an era of these sort of drone-operated warfare where any possibility of bravery on your part is basically eliminated, for one thing. And it just comes down to the deployment of pure ruthlessness, and that's it. And just the sort of, not just the psychological, but also you place yourself in a position where the only person who can demonstrate any sort of virtue, excellence, courage, or otherwise is your enemy. Depending on what side it is, because, as far as I know, both sides are likely implementing this sort of methodology. So that is really, it seems like that right there is quite unprecedented. The V2 sort of rockets during World War II or something like that, are, I guess, there's a parallel that could be drawn there, but just the, I don't know, the proximity with this whole thing. This is just a totally new epoch of warfare, and which then also entails, let's say, all of this various emotional synchronization, basically the use of social media to present an overall aesthetics package. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's an important. I think warfare is something that is definitely gonna encounter a need for more philosophical analysis, more I feel like most of modernity has been an analysis of warfare primarily from a strategic point of view, and I would definitely put Virilio in the camp of doing a philosophical and a phenomenological analysis of warfare, especially in the context of the kind of post-heroic warfare that the we've seen in the past few decades. I was reading a bit about Napoleon because there's a Napoleon film coming out in like a month from now, and when he was defeated, he was put on an island, put into exile, but he got bored and he decided to return to France. And when he returned to France, the men that were supposed to arrest him just broke down crying and joined him, like joined him for another battle. And I was thinking that this sort of kind of more traditional warfare is so alien to us today, because what the capacity to exert violent force on one from a distance sort of rejects is the actual leader or the general being on the battlefield with the army and so forth, which Napoleon would have been. And if you sort of read about these figures, they're so alien to us today, right? Because you have these tacticians who are almost like bureaucrats. They're more like military personnel more than like soldiers, and they're conducting these warfare from a safer and safer distance, of course. So it's changed the whole landscape of warfare, I think, in the 20th century, and then in particular in the 21st century with all these new methodologies. I would say that the Ukrainian war is also, though, somewhat the product of the limitation to the kind of nuclear negotiating treaties of like, superpowers cannot really engage in proper warfare because it will lead to a nuclear war. And I do think the Ukraine war sort of undermines that premise. But nonetheless, the drone technologies, as you were mentioning, are definitely being used there. And it's very strange to see these technologies often being recorded and live streamed, not just utilized, but actually recorded and live streamed. And you see on Twitter, people just like casually consuming images of warfare, and you have to wonder what effect that will have on us in the long term. I'm not convinced that it's going to simply, you have one argument which will say that will make us it will desensitize us to violence, therefore we will accept that we will become more violent. Maybe, but you could go the other way around and say it's sort of detaching our phenomenological understanding of violence. It's we're scrolling through a cat video and a random tweet and then a picture of like warfare or video of warfare. They all kind of blur into the same banal spectacle. That may not make us necessarily more violent or something. That may actually just sort of further alienate us from the phenomena of violence, because in the post-war era, of course, we are very, very much alienated from actual violence. So you have all of these phenomena going on. One last thing I would mention is also the information technology in terms of GPSs and tracking. Virilio, he does bring up the silent sentry, which was the Kosovo war tactic which NATO used, which was basically to use, I think it was television satellites, to use those television satellites to like map out a kind of panoptical view of what was going on the ground, what was going on the ground in Kosovo, so that you could have these airstrikes come in more efficiently, but that reducing risk and so forth. The information technologies, like they also give us the ability to engage in what you might call risk reduction, panoptically viewing things before you go into them, tacticians who can like view people's headsets. Like if you're a soldier and you have a webcam, um, you can have a soldier like on the battlefield risking his ass, but you as a general or a tactician don't have to be on the battlefield with him. You can just like see everything that he sees through his head cam, and you can have an earpiece in and you can just be giving him orders. So, there's a further alienation from the actual decision makers, from the people on the ground and so forth. So you have all of these, like, basically, as you were pointing to, the kind of like heroization of warfare, the kind of the stripping of courage from it. And I would say also, potentially even certain issues with kind of different classes of people. Some people are actually soldiers on the battlefield risking their ass. The decision makers are just in the bunkers. These communication technologies sort of disrupt the whole sort of structure of the military, the whole ethos of the military in that way. And I think that these changes have obviously gone on for decades, if not extremely long time. I mean, I think World War I, there was lots of new different kind of modalities of warfare being introduced. You have things like sarin gas, shelling, these sorts of things that weren't around in the 19th century. So you've all these different changes, but I think Virilio is a very good analyst of how information and communication technologies seem to affect warfare, seem to change the structure of it. And obviously the Ukraine war has just kind of revealed all of these things to us, and we're sort of experiencing it for the first time. But like, two things are sort of happening here. The post-war era is coming to an end. We have war in Europe now, or at least on the edge of Europe. We're not going to have this unipolar structure of the United States being completely in control. It's going to be more multipolar, which does mean the conflicts are actually going to be more common and more likely. So I wouldn't view Ukraine as an anomaly. I would be looking at Ukraine from a Virillian perspective and saying certain trends are going to continue on to whatever is next. The next conflict is going to incorporate these modalities, exaggerate them in certain ways, and so forth. And that means the whole of modern societies are going to adjust around that. Just like when gunpowder was invented, all of these kingdoms, all of these societies had to adjust to that. So the same thing I think is going to happen. The conflict seems very much like almost like a testing ground, really, for these sorts of strange modalities, like dropping bombs on people with these drones and so forth.
And what is it? I think that the story of like Napoleon's escape was even slightly more dramatic than even you were referencing there, which is that I understand he escaped from the island and then immediately started like turning battalions to the point where he had a couple thousand men, and as he was like marching on wherever the Bourbon dynasty had set themselves up, the troops that they put out to oppose him, I think he literally presented himself in front of them and said, "Hey, if anybody's going to shoot their emperor, do it now." And they basically fell in, something along these lines. So yeah, basically, this is an era where generals such as he, there's all sorts of reports of literally cannonballs, like literally landing within meters of the guy. And now at this point, even though some theater commanders do present themselves on the battlefield from time to time, like if you're the head of CENTCOM or whatever, you're in all likelihood, you're going to be hanging out quite far from where anything is actually taking shape. Obviously, this is all in the backdrop of, mutually assured destruction. So it's all done by cutouts, proxies, through financial support, and so on and so forth. They'll know, of course, you do have contractors and other people. Ultimately, one parallel, because Virilio writes a text called Desert Screen, where he's talking about the Gulf War, and basically the idea that, peaceful people for the first time ever, I think during the Civil War, in the U.S., you had some of the very well-to-do basically took out Champagne to like some of the first battles, like Bull Run, expecting to see like a quite hasty retreat on, by opposing forces, and they ended up getting the opposite. But here, for the first time, you have the ability to witness warfare in real time. Even though looking back at it today, I saw this as a young kid. Basically, you're looking at CNN night vision with like this basically like fireworks display of the bombardment of like Baghdad or what have you, and counterfires, anti-air going off. um, the parallel that I drew, and by today's standard scale and the proportion is it's totally incommensurable. But to look at like you can go on Twitter and see the operation of the Iron Dome against all of these missiles and something like that. To me, there's a parallel there where basically it's like Desert Screen on steroids, as it were, and taking us into a quite relatively uncertain future in terms of what the hell's going to go on with all this stuff.
To kind of roll back to the earlier point about the crisis, one crisis causing another crisis. We have a crisis, we respond to it, and it only causes another crisis. I think that I critique or Virilio critique anyone who critiques this sort of post-heroic warfare, killing from a distance, these totally one-sided attacks, lack of courage, lack of virtue, lack of the generals being on the battlefield. These are all totally like legitimate critiques, but there's another risk which comes from this, another uncertainty, which is that if you have these kind of systems of control, systems of military control, whether those be drones, whether those be the Iron Dome, that do sort of give you a very one-sided, almost godlike sense of power. You can just attack these people and they have no way of retaliating. You're not putting yourself in danger. It leads to a kind of very flabby and very self-assured society. But just to reference what happened in Israel recently, if there's some sort of breakdown and your sense of power is a very systemic, technologically systemic sort of dome, or it's very reliant on technological systems, instead of the classical, discipline, troops, and so forth. Once that system starts to break down and you've made a lot of enemies, like, you don't want to be in that position. You know what I mean? Like, that's like the gates, the floodgates are opening, and all the grievances that have built up over the decades from these kind of self-assured people in very safe places, shooting at other people and so on. Those grievances build up, and as soon as those systems start to break down, you're going to have a kind of a potentially very disastrous and violent outcome. And I think that, again, to reference Israel, that's kind of what we're seeing. So there's the critique of these technologies from the ethical perspective, how they're using them, but there's also the critique of the fact that it sort of atrophies our need to actually use reason at all in, how do we treat people? How do we treat our neighbors? If we treat them one way, we're going to make enemies. And, maybe that's inevitable in some sense, but in another sense, you want to be careful about how many enemies you make, because you don't want to surround yourself by enemies, because your fortresses and your walls and your distances, this is a very important point about space. If you have the capacity to shoot drones all the way from the Washington to the Middle East and not put yourself in danger, it creates the sense in which those distances give you an extreme sense of safety and security and power. But they're also reliant on technologies which could break down and things could change, and you're putting yourself in a kind of very tricky position once that happens. And that sort of brings us back into the 9/11 question earlier, because what 9/11 was in many ways was a sudden intrusion into into an environment which felt very safe. It was a sudden intrusion, and then and it created these sorts of response mechanisms of fear and so on. So yeah, so I would say that Virilio is very much an analyst of how not just the ethics of the technology, but sort of the kind of stupefying and and perhaps the kind of ignorance in which these technologies can sort of cultivate in the users of them as well. And that's an important factor to take into account.
Obviously, on the one hand, you have kind of the Hegelian notion that the conditions of your domination can lead to your downfall. And, I think that could be broadly sort of construed across the totality of the West on the one hand. And then the idea that basically, because of the fact that we're out of touch, not just like, not symbolically, but quite literally in the phenomenological sense, this is something that Virilio argues has led to a certain pitilessness, a technoscientific barbarism, a future where it's all sanitized, sublimated, sterilized violence. What that all entails, one potential implication politically that I draw out of his work is that what we're going to observe, technical destructuring of the theoretical groundwork for democracy, which was rooted in popular sovereignty or whatever with the 18th century Enlightenment. On his warfare model, the claim would be something that, it had to do with basically arms. And he makes the assertion in Speed in Politics that history proceeds at the speed of its weapon systems. So at that point in time, you could say you had a total decentralization of let's say like firearms, as it were, musketry, what have you, the, various weapons of war. And that rather than, let's say during the medieval period, this is something that's transformed by techniques. And basically now we're seeing new transformations in the realm of, the development of warfare that is going to entail political transformations that are probably consistent with what Bratton calls, basically a type of planetary scale, technocratic rationalism. At the same time, Virilio, he invokes a quote by Sun Tzu. I think it's very good. He says, weapons are tools of ill omen. They sort of have a double implication. The cannon could be turned on you, particularly as it relates to thermonuclear weaponry and the like. We cover these sorts of subject matters and more, but particularly in, 6 main categories that we draw from Virilio's work. And these include speed, territory, emotional synchronization, accidents, aesthetics, and then what Virilio calls gray ecology. Our course on Virilio, which is entitled Thinking at Light Speed, we're going to kick it off on November 4th. It runs on Saturdays. You could pick up our free study guide. It can be downloaded. We'll put the link in the description, as well as the link to the site, to the landing page. And if you use the coupon code SPEED, you could get $50 off the cost of the course. And if you're interested in learning more about these topics and the overall state of emergency, or pick up the study guide, sign up for the course, and we hope to see you in November. Otherwise, many thanks to Owen. Thanks a lot, and see you in the next video.